What?
All right, welcome to ConCon, Consciousness Conversations. I'm DR.
And I'm Ben.
And, oh, go ahead.
And I'm Jeff.
Yeah, we have a very special guest, Jeff Harris, today, who's joining us. Jeff works at OpenAI. We've been friends for a really long time. Ben works on AI at NVIDIA, so we're going to be talking a lot about the intersection between consciousness and AI today. We've been teasing this for weeks on the podcast, so if you've been following along. So let's start with, I'd like to just give a minute to Jeff to talk about kind of your background, both like how you got into AI, but also what your interests are in consciousness. I know we've had a lot of these kinds of conversations in the past.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I think of my interest in consciousness as coming from a few different places. The first was, early psychedelic experiences and just waking up to how vast the landscape of consciousness was and how the default version of it was, good in some ways, but also like pretty lacking in others. So that's been kind of an ongoing exploration.
Wait, the default version of consciousness?
Yeah, the one before you like attune it more or modify it
Got
either
it.
with substances or with your own brain. Maybe growing up, it was like there is one consciousness. And then in my early 20s, realizing that there's an infinitude of consciousnesses and some of them are great and some of them are scary, and just exploring that. Related to that, I've had a meditation practice for the last 6 or so years, and that's been really taking the stuff from psychedelics and just trying to figure out how to modulate your own brain and how you can tweak the conscious experience by just using your attention really carefully, frustratingly. And then I think the third thing is I've been really interested in AI since I was a kid. I remember reading Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near when I was 13 and just being like, yeah, I'm going to transcend. I'm not going to die. It's all happening in my lifetime. And maybe I lost some enthusiasm for that in the early 20s, but I've actually been regaining it lately. I think in the last few years, we've just seen AI kind of accelerating, and I'm sort of feeling very promising about it. And I think that it maybe has a chance of helping us understand consciousness in a much more empirical way than what we've been doing with neuroscience and stuff like that. So I do view AI as one of the big bets that humanity's making in terms of how we will understand this great mystery.
DR, did you read the Singularity is Near?
Yeah.
I remember, I think it was in my early 20s, buying it and then seeing how dense it was, and then seeing how many claims are made in rapid succession that basically don't seem to have a lot of depth backing them. And then I was just like, okay, screw this guy.
Yeah.
But I definitely did go through a phase where I wanted it to be basically my religion. I wanted to believe that I'm going to ascend.
It has
Big
a
time.
religious quality to it.
Well, and it was in my post-religious era when I discovered that. It was one of the first books I read in that phase, that was more technology AI focused, and it definitely, it liberated me a little bit from the need for legacy. I think for when you're religious, there's this kind of immortality piece that's just baked in. Oh, you're going to go to heaven, you're going to do whatever. And then it was oh wait, I'm going to die and I'm not going to exist anymore. And then I felt this burden of legacy. And then when I realized oh, maybe I will transcend, then it was kind of oh, maybe I don't have to worry about my legacy as much. And that's kind of persisted in a good way. I don't know, even if as I've ebbed and flowed on my kind of feelings about that book. But I do think he's probably kind of been validated a little bit in these, it's, his stuff that he would chart all these innovations and things. It's we're kind of probably right on schedule with what he had envisioned.
There's a good Les Wrong post that's kind of critiquing him 20 years later. And I think some of his predictions, transistor density compute, are totally spot on. And then he has other things about we'll be constantly video presencing with each other and 3D renderings for phone calls that is just totally off the mark. But I think he probably held up way better than we would have if we made those predictions 20 years ago.
One of the things I really liked was the nano bot clouds or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're kind of doing, it's not at the scale, but with the drone displays and those crazy dragon drone things that are happening. It's kind of exactly what he described.
Yeah. An argument I remember that's kind of related to that is three progressions of more and more perilous risk. So the first one is like biological risk. We'll get better and better at synthesizing dangerous biology. The cure for that, in his view, was like nanotechnology and the ability to like monitor at a biological level. But that has like the gray goo fear, and then we wipe out all of existence, all of life on the planet. And then the cure for that is like true artificial intelligence that can like just truly understand everything that's happening at one time. And then if that goes wrong, there's sort of no cure left.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from a Jon Stewart bit years ago, and it was just like, technology, the thing that almost solves the problem it just created.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, let's kick off by talking about AI and what it has to say about the mind and consciousness. And maybe you guys can talk about your understanding of how AI works and why it is an interesting window into the human mind.
Yeah, I think there's different like degrees of like interesting answers you could give to that. So one I think is, we have an artificial neural network, right? It was sort of made with linear algebra in mind, loosely inspired by a biological neuron. And yeah, when you look at sort of the activation space of like, let's say a ConVnet doing some sort of like a basic image classification task, it actually kind of maps onto parts of our visual cortex, like how that seems to be doing something like a convolution. And so I think there's kind of this interesting thing where maybe there's sort of like convergent, emergent ideas, right? And you can start with like an affine transformation and compose them and stack them and end up with...
Let me back you up, Ben, because I think you used like 10 different vocabulary words that were like really challenging. So you're like, let me try and summarize, and then you can kind of... So it sounds like what you're saying is, and feel free to hop in here too, Jeff. It sounds like what you're saying is like, we're classifying images with an AI. And it seems like it looks a little bit like the way our brains classify images, or it's using an architecture that was patterned after the way the human brain works.
Well, I'm saying you can start with something very abstract mathematical and sort of do, like, essentially you have these connections between them. You have compositions of very simple functions. None of that seems to look like a brain.
Yeah.
And yet, when you sort of do this optimization process, you end up with something that has these emergent properties, like the same kind of properties you can probe in a brain. And so a lot of people would complain, like, why do we even call them neural networks? Like, they're nothing like a brain. The brain's so complicated, blah, blah, blah. We don't understand anything about the brain. But I have a feeling that artificial neural networks with backprop isn't the only way to end up with a brain-like thinking piece of matter.
Yeah.
And so to me, like, from that perspective, it's kind of like the substrate independence thing that we talked about in a previous podcast. Like, it doesn't seem so silly to sort of see the emergent intelligent things that neural networks are starting to do and say, hey, we could probably learn about the human brain from that emergence, given that emergence seems to be independent of the actual sort of underpinning mathematical concepts that are going on at the bottom.
Yeah. And Jeff, maybe you could, I don't know if you want to hop in on any of those topics, but it would maybe specifically talk about training and backprop and how that stuff works.
Yeah. I think the angle that's just really compelling to me is thinking about neural networks as we have a limited number of neurons in the computer, and we're just feeding in more and more of reality into the same number of neurons, and you're just trying to get it better and better at modeling reality. So at first, it's just memorizing what you told it and remembering, like, that sentence, these words come after another. But as you feed in more and more data into these networks, it's not just memorizing the sentence, it's trying to guess at the function that produced the sentence, which is like the human brain or like American culture. So you just keep pumping more and more data into a network, and it just gets better and better at modeling reality writ large. And like right now, it's getting pretty good at how humans talk to each other. It's not necessarily super good at like physics, but that might come. And like maybe when we start to feed in different modalities, and maybe like to just tie the biological versus technological question together, like I think there's this kind of feeling of like, the networks want to learn. You just put in data and you actually don't have to do very much else. Like that's the whole thing we've discovered with scaling laws is you just keep feeding more and more data and they get better and better at understanding reality. And maybe that's like the exact process that happened with us, like, you know, all those hundreds of millions of years ago.
It kind of reminds me like Michael Graziano from Princeton, you know, he sort of says, well, the sort of the evolutionary benefit of like predicting what someone's going to do, like socially, like sort of leads to a theory of mind about that person, right? You have to get inside their head to understand, are they going to attack me? Are they going to try to like mate with me? And that's sort of, it's kind of like, maybe there's, I think in the like the ChatGPT case, like it has a theory of mind. Why? Because of the exact thing you said. Like if it's trying to predict the next word and this corpus is made from human data and someone's writing an Amazon review, you kind of need to know, is this person mad? Does this person hate the product, or do they like the product? Because that very much influences the distribution of next words that they could say. And so I think it's kind of interesting that just sort of basic future prediction in some sense might, I mean, going back to like Carl Friston stuff, like might be all you need for all of this apparatus to sort of form. Interesting.
Yeah. So the AI is basically designed for prediction, right? And you're saying, which I think I agree with, that we're also designed for prediction. Like we're generating content for the people around us. And so we're trying to sort of like sequence in a word that we think is going to be socially acceptable or creative or interesting or a great brand name or whatever, that's based on all of the understanding that we have of our culture. So you said something that was really interesting. So like, let's say the training data for an AI was a single sentence, right? Like John likes to eat apples, right? And so you type in John likes to eat, and there's one thing that it can produce, right? And so as the library gets deeper, denser and denser, the potential options there, especially if you say like, hey, I want a creative response to this sentence, it's going to sort of have a lot more tools to sort of like insert in there. So if you think this is actually really helpful, like I think I've been thinking of the AI components as neurons, right? But if you think of that, it's like I love the idea that, airplanes don't look like birds. Like there's some principles from how birds work that we like apply to how airplanes work, but really they're completely different types of mechanisms, even though they both fly, right? And so and that's just turns out it's way easier for us to power airplanes than it would be to power something like a bird. And I think the same thing is true. It's like, so if you think about like, instead of trying to fly, we're just trying to predict. And these are two models, but they both actually are being quite successful in the same way.
Yeah, and actually I think this is one of the reasons people are afraid. Like people like Hinton have said things like, well, maybe we've short-circuited. So we know we have an existence proof for AGI through evolutionary processes. And maybe now with backprop, we sort of have figured out another method that's much quicker, right? Than like having to sort of evolve over millions of years intelligence. And that can be kind of scary if you extrapolate that, I guess. I don't know if I buy into that kind of doomerism, but it is interesting to think if there's sort of all of these ways to a single point, which is intelligence, and it can come from sort of any type of sort of basic prediction engine or very simple directives like next token prediction. It's kind of interesting to think about how non-special intelligence might be, right?
Like it is the emergent property of just any kind of like neural complexity can start really simple, and you just like keep feeding it more and more data, and it's just going to get better at modeling reality.
So I think that this might be a good segue into one of the so we were talking about, there's this paper, let's see, what was it called? It just came out. Consciousness and Artificial Intelligence, Insights from the Science of Consciousness. And it's this huge list of authors, and they're talking about kind of relating AI to a bunch of different current theories of consciousness, like general workspace theory, the attention schema theory. And then we saw we talked about this in the podcast previously, the Blooms did a presentation about what a conscious AI would look like that is patterned after general workspace theory, and which was really interesting. So I think there's this interest in like, what are the motivations? Like, how is that being like connecting how we'd predict things, which it seems to be that we're predicting things based on emotions. Like we're having experiences or feelings about things, and then we're using that to feed in. And so I think there's a big concern that as you get into AI, we're creating the space for potentially emotive AI that could suffer and things like that.
Yeah, you want to jump into the ethics pit?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that there's the emotions piece. Like, so what is the mechanism through which an AI incentivizes its predictions? Maybe that's where I'm trying to go with this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually just next word like loss error, which I think is, we call this like perplexity. So it's like how its word error rate at predicting kind of like subsequent words. And the shocking discovery, which I think is like actually one of the most important things humanity's figured out in the last century, is that you can very reliably predict how perplexity is going to get better and better by just feeding in more and more data and more compute. You can get more and more accurate at predicting next words. So that's pretty mind-blowing. Like when we published GPT-4, you can kind of see that like with, I think it was 1/1000th of the compute that it would actually took to train GPT-4, we perfectly modeled like exactly what the perplexity was going to be in the final model. Very surprising that it's like a law of science.
Perplexity, what does that word mean?
Perplexity is like how it's next word prediction. It's just how good you are at predicting the next word and like what your error rate is there. So you can, from way smaller compute runs, make these really ambitious predictions. And then the other thing that's just mind-blowing is perplexity correlates really well with a bunch of just general neural cognitive tests. So like LSATs, like AP bio tests, things like that. So that's kind of my take on kind of what's happening in the industry right now is the world has woken up to these scaling laws where if you looked 5 years ago and you asked people what they would do with GPUs, they'd have a bunch of different ideas. And now if you ask people what they do with GPUs, they just make bigger and bigger neural networks because we can just see this curve, and so far it hasn't stopped. So we can just keep throwing more and more at it, and like what's after LSAT? And
yeah, what is after LSAT? I mean, where do these curves lead in your opinions, both of you guys?
I mean, time will tell. Like, I think if you look at GPT-4, it's like as good as a high schooler at most forms of cognition. And most textual forms of cognition, it's probably way worse, like physiologically or navigating the real world. If you look at GPT-2, it was like a elementary school kid, maybe even a little bit less. Like it would kind of form sentences, but they weren't totally coherent. You could push it around and it would be like very incoherent. So, a couple past that, and is it as good as an AI researcher? And then instead of having, 100 AI researchers or 1,000, you have 1 million, and they're working constantly all the time. And that's sort of like a big change.
Yeah, I mean, you probably know better than I do, but I think there's sort of a debate on, are we going to run out of data at some point? I've heard people, maybe Karpathy, saying like, no, we've got too much data. But there is a question in like, if you run out of data, or you run out of data that's useful, because not all data is sort of the same in terms of training, then you either need to come up with an algorithm that's more sample efficient, or you need to start sort of generating data somehow, which is sort of another
the snake eating its tail there, right?
Yeah, it's another blocker in some sense, because there's some research out there that shows that can kind of make things sort of get into a very interesting like sort of outer distribution, but it doesn't realize it, and then like reality starts getting weird for it, kind of thing. It's like saving a JPEG like 1 million times. It's gonna not look.
This sounds sort of like giving an AI drugs. Like your world perceptions start skewing because you're in this like hot state or whatever.
But I don't think I don't know if we run out of data and we need to simulate it, I don't know if that is a fundamental blocker. I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. If we have to suddenly come up with something more sample efficient, that I think might take longer. But in either case, if we trust Karpathy, and I feel like this may actually be the case, we may have more data, than we will ever need to develop an intelligent AI, like with sky's the limit.
So back to what you were saying then, is the difference between GPT-2 and GPT-4 is literally just the amount of data, or is it training? Is there other stuff that's happening behind the scenes?
Not my area of expertise exactly. There's probably a lot more going on, but I think even before we discovered transformers and like the whole GPT paradigm, we were seeing these scaling laws observe, which is just like you throw more compute, you throw more data, and it just gets better and better at modeling stuff. Like some of the original voice recognition software that was kind of like state of the art in like 2012, 2014 was just people realizing you can just shove in as much data as you want. So we've been on this like exponential curve for something like 10 years. Mm-hmm. But I think in the last couple years, it's really felt like the broader industry has woken up to it. And now there's just like way more money going into GPUs, way more research going into like algorithmic improvements. But the curve is sort of the exponential the whole way.
I actually, I don't know if this is like a shared opinion, but I actually, when I see that the scaling laws are predictable, that gives me comfort in terms of like AI safety. There was a paper that came out a while ago, somewhat debated afterwards, but they were showing like almost like these phase change sort of abilities that would be not there at all, and then suddenly it could do long multiplication, and that seemed really kind of spooky. That I did not like, because I don't like the idea of like we see where it's going, we can predict it. Oh wait, no, now there's a phase change and it can do something totally inexplicably unpredictable. But that was sort of, I'm not going to say discredited, but people said, well, if you actually use different metrics that aren't so like 0 or 1, can it do it or can't it do it, you actually see that scaling laws come back and look smooth again.
Yeah.
And when you have smooth, predictable scaling laws, I think you can better predict your future like situation and like the future intelligence of these, just based on like the hardware that's coming out and like how much GPUs people are able to amass. That seems more tenable than someone accidentally like, training an AI that undergoes a phase change and all of a sudden it's like godlike powers or something.
Right. Yeah, 100% agree with that. And also just to pick some examples, like, if you looked at early GPTs, they couldn't do arithmetic. And then that's like an emergent property at some point. Like GPT-4 is pretty good at arithmetic. It's less good if there's a different number of digits that you're working with from the two different numbers that you're adding or multiplying. And you don't know exactly what properties are going to emerge, but it's pretty consistent that like as perplexity gets better, as you get better at that next token error prediction, you're just getting little minor tweaks and kind of the deficiencies of the previous generation.
Well, it's pretty interesting to think about that relative to a human brain, where very obviously we have kind of different neural modules that have become specialized in different things, right? You don't use like your visual cortex to sort of do language that we have. And it's kind of crazy that like, it sort of speaks to like the neuroplasticity of AI, I guess. You could just use this one thing,
yeah,
and it will if our language was good enough, it would like you could basically see the world with it, right?
Yeah. You see this with things like LangChain, where people are basically creating separate variants of GPTs, and they're just like, one of them is really good at writing, I don't know, say a blog post, and then another one is really good at critiquing it, and then another one is really good at like looking at it from a public relations point of view. And maybe a few years ago I would have thought of AGI as sort of like this omniscient like god thing, but it really seems like the way it's at least emerging right now is more like submodules in the brain. Exactly, like you get really specialized things that can kind of work in concert with each other.
Yeah, which is sort of like the Bloom stuff that we'll maybe talk about here.
Yeah, so to bring that up, I actually thought that's where you're going, not the ethics thing when you brought up the Bloom thing.
I was kind of
so I would say there's like two interesting things. Like if we look at least two interesting things. If we look at the sort of human brain, what's going on and what we can see, there's like all this compartmentalization. There's also feelings. These seem to be limited or not at all present in like the large scale AI systems. And that compartmentalization, going to sort of what you were saying, Jeff, it does make me wonder, well, let's say even from like an economical point of view, it makes sense to have smaller AIs that are more expert, that collaborate, than one giant one that costs like a lot of flops, right, for next token prediction.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And we see this, like everybody's moving to mixture of experts and things like this. And I think that is part of it, but it's very interesting to see that's a very different direction. People moving to mixture of experts to try to like get the costs down, to what the Bloom model is, which basically starts as a mixture of experts, because they say, what is consciousness like in this global
and mixture of
workspace
experts theory? Meaning you just have subspecialized.
You have all
modules.
These like subspecialties that are sort of competing for attention and the sort of the conscious like top, right? That was sort of the Bloom model. And I feel like it's an interesting case of how you open up the discussion, where it's like, here we have the Blooms. They're like, Turing Award winning computer scientists from Carnegie Mellon. They're looking at the brain, being inspired by the brain, and coming up with a system that these AI scientists are sort of coming up with to just like make their systems cheaper to run. Right.
I mean, which is sort of, like evolution, right? Where it's like ultimately you're developing all of this intense intelligence just to like have sex with someone to have your children to the next generation, right? It's like this very, so, okay, well, let's, I want to move over to, I want to do a quick survey because I think we're probably all in agreement here, but I'll be curious. So, interestingly, in this paper that I was just referencing, they totally dismiss IIT. There's also, which is integrated information theory. We've talked about it before on the podcast. And there was also a paper that just came out where a whole bunch of people, haven't read it yet, but there's a whole bunch of people who are like, IIT is pseudoscience and it's like a garbage theory of consciousness, but it gets a lot of play. A lot of people talk about it. But one of their contentions is that software could never be conscious. Like they think that like, an interconnected like sheet of neurons is conscious, but like an LLM is not conscious. So I wanted to sort of take the pulse of the crew here of like, can you have, so we might call this like substrate dependence or embodiment. And this was a hot topic at the conference as well. Can you have something that is not embodied in something like a human that is conscious? Can an AI, which would basically be like, can an AI be conscious?
It's honestly hard for me to imagine the answer to that question being no. Like at some point you're going to be able to imitate in software, like the connections in the brain. You could do that with like, an electron microscope scanning layer by layer by layer and just like building up like exactly the same pathways. Maybe there's something like intrinsic in biological flesh that is, that is where consciousness comes from, and it's sort of there and it's not in transistors, but it's really hard for me to imagine that being right.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that if you look at like people like Roger Penrose who are really insisting that there's these quantum microtubules, and if you don't have microtubules, you're screwed. That's a necessary component. Well, then the substrate matters, right?
Yeah.
But I think that they're like a holdout, and most everybody else, I think, is pretty much on the side that like no matter like what you stipulate, those dominoes are going to fall eventually.
Yeah.
There's no fundamental block. Like the only fundamental block that anyone can think of is these quantum microtubules, which are really controversial, basically. So to me,
well, if you think of there's people talk about the brain versus the body, and it's like, oh, that's a sensation in your body, not your brain. It's like, what do you mean? It's all one big fucking jumble
all in
of
the
neurons.
simulation.
Yeah,
Like
exactly. It's all part of the same system. So eventually those should be simulatable as well.
Yeah.
And I think, emotions at some level, like the long division one, I thought was an interesting example. Like maybe emotions or reportable emotions or whatever are one of those things that, is just on that curve. And eventually it's like, oh yeah, I'm feeling fear or I'm feeling anger as an emergent property that's just aiding in the whole prediction process.
So I wonder regarding feelings. I mean, I was sort of making a claim earlier that intelligence, I think, is sort of non-specific and maybe a general thing if you just add up enough sort of compositional elements in data and some sort of rough optimization routine. But feelings might be a unique characteristic of an evolutionary process. Maybe. Like it seems like harder to come up with like a logical argument why feelings must exist in an intelligent system. That being said, I could see how you could maybe bootstrap feelings just from like a theory of mind. Like let's say we just take as a given that GPT, and there's research here that it has some theory of mind. I feel like from a theory of mind, if you truly can like get inside someone's head to be able to predict what they're thinking, like you might have to have some concept of what does it feel like to be inside their head. And at that point, you're sort of booting up a whole mess of your neurons to try to simulate a feeling. And once you simulate a feeling, like maybe it feels like something. So that I can see like that argument, but I kind of do wonder if it's sort of like a special component of an evolutionary process, and that it wouldn't be maybe existing in all sorts of ways you could arrive at intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I think feelings, kind of no matter how you define consciousness, right? Like, unlike AI, where you're kind of building up all of this intelligence to be able to take action, like neurons and amoebas and life from the beginning was designed for action, right? It's taking action before it's conscious. So consciousness is like an outgrowth of like trying to become, you know, more active, more intelligent, whatever, but it already has figured out how to act, which is based on those emotions. So, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the Yuval Harari thing from Homo Deus, where he talks about just because we are both intelligent, we're the most intelligent and the most conscious, doesn't mean that artificial intelligence also needs to be the most conscious.
That's right.
These things could be sort of uncoupled.
Yeah. I think about feeling as kind of like the loss function for our learning process, where basically like at a really primitive level, our bodies and maybe even amoebas are like clutching for good feelings, sex, food, and then running away from bad things like getting stabbed or, you know, getting tired or hungry. And then
Relatively recent phenomenon, getting stabbed, but yes.
well, you get teeth go into even
That's
an
a good
amoeba.
point. Yeah, there you go.
So that's and then kind of like where natural selection is played in is kind of giving us like richer and richer versions of these loss functions, where it's like, yep, food is good up until a point, and then you're oversaturated and your cells are full, and then food is bad, and it's kind of just evolving and evolving and evolving. So we have at this point this like incredibly complicated function that we're optimizing for, that's like constantly shifting. It's not like a single number that you're hitting, but like once you get saturated in one way, you're craving something else. So, and that's really like a lot of what evolution has pushed our brains to do, is be like more adaptive in what it's optimizing for.
Yeah, and really trying to. It's not about it's not about predicting words or whatever. It's about predicting behavior. What should I be doing now?
Right.
But I think there's still like the open question. Like the Roomba has a negative stimulus in that it has a bump sensor, it hits a wall.
You should recap the Roomba argument.
Well, let me just say, well, I always use the Roomba because it's like, you know, sometimes people use like a thermostat. It's like the simplest possible, like senses its environment and then acts. I think Roomba is more fun because it has basically more action in the environment. But I guess I don't want to get into the Roomba thing actually, but what I want to say is it seems like you could have very rich positive and negative stimuli without any sort of valence to it, or any, like you could say, you could sort of indexically understand all these different environmental stimuli, but it doesn't seem like that must be coupled with pain or pleasure.
Yeah. I guess maybe I can use that as a segue into some of the meditation stuff I'm interested in. Because I think like, one of the like core revelations in Buddhism was sort of like, you get yourself more and more concentrated, you're focusing on a feeling, like it's getting subtler and subtler and subtler, and you can kind of just like see this tiny grabby motion that your brain is doing. It's called tana, where it's kind of either like grabbing onto a good feeling or like pushing away from a bad feeling, and you're just doing this in like micro ways, like 10 to 20 times a second for all of your sensation. If you just like still your mind over and over again, and this is not something that I'm advanced enough to be able to do consistently, but if you just keep paying attention and keep being like, oh, that sensation, the grabbing doesn't feel good, and you just keep doing that, eventually your brain lets go completely, and you just stop grabbing, stop feeling the positive, negative valence. And that's like the moment of awakening. That's like the lights turn off without the grabbing, without the positive or negative sensation that you're going towards. And it's really, really subtle. It's like a microscopic positive, negative feeling. There actually isn't anything at all.
Yeah.
So kind of, thinking about that, like I think I'm not convinced that you can experience things without a little bit of valence in them.
But yeah, so maybe an AI is just a really zen.
I mean, the AI has valence. Like the AI has clearly like, this was a better score or a worse score. So it's kind of constantly optimizing. That said, I don't think AIs are conscious.
Yeah,
I guess we could compare, like you can differentiate between different colors, like indexically, and there seems to be, maybe there's a tiny amount of valence there, but it's not the same as like getting pinched versus getting massaged.
Sure. Yeah,
for
sure. Well, in fact, you have cultures where people will specify colors as good or bad, and then a different culture where they'll specify it in an inverted way. So,
and the meditation claim is like, you can perceive the color red, but to perceive it, your brain is doing this like very small thing, trying to hold on to it and preserve it from like one instance of perception into the next instance of perception. Like all of perception is doing this. You're just like grabbing the sensation that in its microscopic way is flashing in and out of existence constantly, but like we can't accept that. We can't like see them, their impermanence, and you're just grabbing. And if you stop grabbing, the red stops being there. Like it just fades.
Okay, so I think it sounds like we're in agreement here that consciousness should be able to exist independent of substrate. Like an AI could be conscious.
Yeah.
We don't think that AI is currently conscious or 10% conscious.
I love
Is the idea of 10% conscious even a coherent
No,
thing?
it wasn't.
It's like an expected value, basically.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah.
Which was it was funny because Anil Seth gets up who's another consciousness guy at the end of the session, and he's just like, because he based this in part on credences, meaning like researchers in the field, like what percentage chance do they give? Like that's part of the metric. And Anil Seth gets up and he's like, well, this is just going to keep changing. Like we just keep, and this is a big point in the singularity is near, actually, that like as these technologies become more and more prevalent, you just keep pushing the goalposts. Mm-hmm. So you never actually get to a place where people agree because they just keep like throwing that off.
This is making me wonder the Harari thing that you said. Like, do you think there are different degrees of consciousness? Like, is it true that humans are more conscious than cats? And like, what makes that true?
I mean, this is Douglas Hofstadter's kind of contention. He did the Gettelescher Bach book, and then he wrote another book called I Am a Strange Loop, about kind of like, and the whole book is him like shitting on mosquitoes and being like, mosquitoes are conscious, but not like us. And he just like talks about these like degrees. And even at the conference, you know, there were some of the more provocative statements, which, you know, not really provocative, but like in the audience, people would be like, well, this is what I think, would be like the line that they draw where they'll say like, birds and apes are conscious, but like cats are not, or like, you know, mammals are conscious, but like reptiles are not, or these. And so everyone kind of has their line and their definition of like where that exists. But within that, I think is baked the idea that like, you know, animals are conscious to some degree, right?
Seems right.
Yeah. Like it's very tough, I think, to
conscious as in like they're experiencing a qualia.
Well, yeah. So this is kind of like how you define it. So I thought that the guy, Nicholas Humphrey, had one of my favorite sessions about this, and he's like talking about blind sight and basically trying to show, you know, blind sight. So basically you can, your optic nerve, like the connection between your eyes and your mammalian brain, which is kind of the storyteller that's very rich, is severed. Mm-hmm. So if I asked you, do you see anything, you would report being blind. But I could like throw something at you and you could catch it.
Yeah, there's a secondary, like much older, evolutionarily speaking, pathway that we're not conscious of.
Right.
And so this is how frogs, like they will, like if you hold an iPhone in front of a frog with like flies on it, it will just hit them, right? And that's very much tied to this older part of the brain.
Yeah.
So it's like you have, and so his point is basically that like these are two very distinct ways of existing, and that like that, you know, ape brain would be conscious, whereas the
that's right.
The frog brain would not. Yeah.
Well, but the frog might still have other things that are conscious in its brain. Like I'm afraid of this predator or whatever. The example that's coming to me is like your heartbeat. Most of the time you're not conscious of it, but if you exercise and you go for a run, when you finish it, it like has bubbled up into your conscious experience. So there's sort of like this envelope of your sensorium where some parts of it are part of consciousness and some parts of it are just hidden from you, and you can like play with that and you can
So I think, and it speaks to an opinion I have that might be like kind of controversial, which is I think consciousness is sort of there's a requirement that you need to be able to craft a story about it. So if the frog was afraid of the predator, it needs to be able to tell that to itself as a story of itself. And if it's unable to do that, I don't think.
What does a story mean here?
Yeah, so I think that let's loop this back to AI. I think when you train an LLM, if it has no ability to sort of peer into like its own inner workings to craft a story about why it's predicting the next token, I think it's sort of maybe minimally or non-conscious. I think people who are actually looking at explainable AI, this is a very hot take, by the way, but people who are looking at like explainable AI and coming up with basically like, you know, little like sister networks that sit on top of a large LLM to try to explain, to give it a story of why it's saying what it's saying. I think that might be sort of our like oopsie daisy.
We made it conscious.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
And I think one of the reasons I think this is because of like, I've been heavily influenced by that Graziano guy who's sort of, he's looking at places in the brain that basically it's like the attention schema theory. So you have attention, like the frog can attend to the predator, attend to the fly. But that's not actually like the bit that we would like think of as consciousness. It's actually the bit that monitors the attention. Right. And so it's like the dashboard that says, oh, I'm going to choose to ignore this fly over here. That would be a tasty meal because there's something that's about to eat me.
Yeah.
And that monitoring is what we sort of associate with our consciousness. And it's the monitoring of your heartbeat. Right. And you can choose sort of choose where your attention is, but then sort of the information about how you're choosing that story is actually what I think, typically associate with consciousness, if that makes sense.
And to push on this in a provocative way, I haven't really thought of this before, but like if you think about that narrative, there are so many ways in which our narrative that we have about ourselves is fucked, right? Like we have like really broken, one of my favorite books is called The Enigma of Reason. And it talks about how like rationality and language and all this stuff is actually designed for socially convenient stories about ourselves. We go to therapy to kind of like unbundle these stories we've been telling. So it's quite possible that, as we do create a conscious AI, it sees us as quite unconscious because we're creating these narratives. We're doing all this prediction about our own behavior that is just not accurate because we actually can't monitor our internal systems. We don't have that good a sense of our feelings and we're super biased about certain things. So yeah, I think that there's the story, that confabulation about what we do is a big part of the consciousness. And yet ours is like, we think we're doing great, and we are relative to a lot of things, but it's also quite imperfect.
And I think the confabulate thing comes from just like math and logic, right? So if you imagine, like, what is the actual story of why ChatGPT says that next word? Well, it's billions of numbers. That's the actual story. So any explainable AI is just going to be a story about those numbers. It can't encapsulate every single detail, right? There's no way that you could sort of abstract away anything if it's like non-compressible. So like it's going to leave out details that hopefully don't matter as much, and it therefore can get it wrong. This is why our confabulations, our own narratives, are wrong, because what's really going on is like an intense amount of data of electrical activity up there.
Yeah.
And so basically to have a foothold on a sort of any sort of explainable aspect of your own inner workings, you're basically having a less complex story.
Like you're flattening it.
Yeah. And so I think this is also why consciousness feels spooky, because there's a limit to how many times you can sort of loop back and have a complex, a complex story about your own consciousness and a complex story about that complex story. Mm-hmm. Like there's just a limit to that recursion because you're losing details each time. Mm. And so at the pinpoint, it just seems very spooky. This is why qualia, I think, is so convincing to people, because there's not another layer where we can like loop back on it. It's sort of the top. It's the top piece of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But again, these are all sort of like my own personal takes.
Yeah, I mean, this is where like Ben and I I feel like we loop on these things a lot. So I'd be interested in your take on kind of these thoughts.
It's striking me that like what we're defining as consciousness is not clear, and we probably have like subtly different definitions. Like the way that I was entering this was like consciousness. All it is the quality. It's the feeling of like this tea, this matcha looks green. And that's the only thing. The story that I can layer on top of it, then the part of that that's conscious is like the words that are occurring in my head, where I'm like, like there's another variant of qualia that is like thought. There's also, sight, sound, touch. But all that consciousness is the feeling of like I have experienced something. And then when I look at like my body, a lot is happening that my body is aware of, that my brain is aware of, but that is not conscious, that doesn't cross the threshold until like I actually like feel a qualia related to that sensation. So like heartbeat is one of them. Like the inside of my stomach is like only really perceptible if I feel really sick or I feel really hungry or really full. Most of the time it's just like not part of my consciousness. And then the question for me is like, why are things like moving across this threshold from like unconscious to conscious? And it's not clear to me that the mosquito doesn't have the same kind of shtick going on of like a bunch of its body is unconscious and then a little bit is bubbling into the conscious qualia space at every moment.
Oh no, I completely agree. And I think that one book I really like in this space, The Meme Machine, Susan Blackmore. So, if you've read The Selfish Gene, he has the whole chapter on memes. Yeah. So she sort of like takes that to the next level and sort of saying like, humans are meme generators, our brains are designed for this. And one of the things she talks about is like, having thoughts and language or whatever is like valuable probably very occasionally.
Do you think it's part of consciousness, like having thoughts, or is that like an unrelated part of our like tech tree?
I think it is so I think it's a way of essentially preserving, like making more things conscious, right? It's like language and our narrative about ourselves and the social narrative is forcing us to pull more and more. Like you think about meditation, you're noticing your body more. Yeah. And then one of the things that happens is you start to explain that and describe it and talk about it. And then that becomes, or you think about, they always talk about cultures and the development of color. That like you didn't actually see this color until you had a word for it.
Yeah.
Or you didn't actually feel that emotion in that way until you had a word for it. So it becomes this way of like pulling more data forward. And in Meme Machine, she talks about like essentially in words and memes and ideas becoming their own kind of platform and their own kind of cancer on how our brains work. Mm-hmm. We're having way more thoughts than we need to have to like function. Right. And so it's like those thoughts become kind of containers for like pulling more and more and more data from our kind of like valence.
And then it's kind of importantly, like the thoughts are actually like changing what we perceive. So like you're seeing more colors because you have those words.
Yeah.
I think you can also, I think in general, yeah, language is very consciousness expanding, but I think it can also be limiting in that it discretizes you, right, into these meanings of these words. I wanted to say something, and that was kind of what were we talking about right before? Okay, so your comments on qualia, I think there's sort of a nuanced distinction. If you accept qualia as sort of the bedrock of like basically everything, you're leaving the door open for the hard problem, for Chalmers to step in and talk about zombies, and for basically the whole premise of everything to be unanswerable. I think if you think, well, maybe qualia isn't bedrock, it seems fundamental, I think therefore I am, I feel therefore I am, or whatever, but maybe that's just an opinion I have, just like any other opinion. And maybe if I don't put qualia as sort of the fundamental thing at the very bottom, and I leave wiggle room for it to actually be an emergent thing that just feels like bedrock, then I think the hard problem becomes less hard. Are you familiar with the hard problem? Yeah. So that's kind of why I like sort of, I push against this. I don't go to the full, like, I'm an illusionist, we're not actually conscious, like, kind of thing. But I do think sort of like taking qualia off its like pedestal of like this sort of sacred thing at the very bottom of fundamental experience, I think is mainly the best way to get rid of the hard problem.
Wait, so then you would say what is the bottom then in that definition?
I think the bottom is compute. Compute and simulation basically, and I think
prediction, I guess, right?
Prediction, yeah. And self-perpetuating models. And
so qualia being a way of informing the predictive model to sort of get better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, so imagine this. Imagine there is qualia, and this is bedrock experience. And it not only leaves the door open for the hard problem, but it leaves the door open for things like panpsychism and stuff, these are valid theories, but I find them distasteful. I like the more engineering mechanistic descriptions, which would point to qualia being almost like a bit of a delusion we have. Like, oh my God, there's this spooky thing and it's totally unexplainable. What is it like to be a bat? I could never imagine echolocation. I can never imagine a qualia different, telling a blind person what colors are, these sort of like divides that seem unconquerable. And I think that is sort of applying a sort of a pre-existing mystical quality to qualia such that it couldn't be defined in terms of neural processes, right? It makes it really hard, especially talking to someone who is very convinced that qualia is the bedrock thing upon which everything else must be based logically about your existence.
I guess I want to be open to like neural processes don't explain what consciousness is. Like the hard problem of consciousness, like we're not using the right tool to explain that, and maybe like we'll build the right AI system and it will convince us that it's conscious, or we'll like see like a loop in there and be like, oh, that's what the fuck is going on. But I don't want to say like because like the neural toolkit doesn't figure out the hard problem of consciousness. I agree with you. It feels kind of intractable with that toolkit. That doesn't necessarily mean that like we have to reject the qualia bedrock idea.
All right. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I have like another, like it's sort of side. Well, it's not a tangent, but it kind of like it's the opposite side of this coin, right? Which I love talking about, which is we talking about artificial intelligence, right? We're talking about consciousness. Is it artificial intelligence consciousness? Well, what about artificial consciousness? So we're talking about some specific ways of like basic, like the Bloom stuff is really trying to increase intelligence, or the, what did you call it? Where they have the different entities that
like mixture of experts.
Experts, right? As a way of just making something more intelligent, which is totally fair. But what about creating something that is conscious as the goal? Like just sort of using valence, using emotions, like does that feel possible, resonant, interesting, dangerous?
Yeah, let's dive into the ethics. I think that it's dangerous ethically to on purpose or accidentally create a conscious, artificially conscious entity.
Like a baby, for example.
Yes.
I didn't choose to be born.
I mean, I think the reason is we have this intuition that consciousness prescribes some sort of like moral status, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the whole killing of animals thing. Like, is it okay to kill a frog? Like, is it okay to kill a dog? You know, this sort of things. Like, these decisions are sort of in part made, well, how cute it is, but also like how conscious we think it is, how much
suffering it's going to
exactly.
feel. Yeah.
And if consciousness, maybe there's an artificial consciousness that does not have capacity for suffering. I'm open to that idea, but I think there is this idea in my mind that if you make a minimally artificial conscious entity that has capacity for suffering, now you can do it sort of at scale, as the AI engineers would say. And that seems
suffering as a service.
Yes.
I guess I want to be like, you also have joy as a service too. Like you could have
exactly
trillions.
Well, I'm just thinking,
beings.
like children who, like very few children are going to be like, oh, I wish I was never born, right? Like if you could make this conscious AI entity and it reports being happy about its existence in spite of its suffering, like,
I mean, I also, just for what it's worth, yeah, maybe my opinions here are a little inchoate, but like I think you could potentially, I don't think suffering and pleasure are sort of like the things we should track. I sort of reject utilitarianism, not as a whole, but like most of it, because I think like meaning, for example, is more important. Like you could have someone that suffers their whole life, but if they feel like their life has meaning, I think ultimately that's more valuable.
Yeah. This is a Viktor Frankl kind of philosophy.
Yeah.
Right?
And so I kind of think like suffering at scale does seem horrifying, but yeah, maybe, but all of these things are sort of wrapped in consciousness. I think once you have a conscious entity, there is sort of a status for meaning as well, right?
There's moral implication in a way that maybe is less true before.
I do think though that this is, we like in attributing special status to these things, we also attribute special value. Like we have conversations with humans, we like invest in those relationships, we celebrate their birthdays, right? Like we really value those things. Thus, like
because it's conscious.
Yeah, right. And so I think in a similar way, we could really value, like in a Her, like the movie kind of model, really value a conscious AI that does have, it's like a digipet that
it's not totally clear to me that she's conscious there versus like
no I agree, right? But like in trying to sort of make something that feels more like that, like we're entering this like loneliness epidemic, right, in our society. I was just seeing this thing as like 1 in 7 males have no friends, which is insane. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, maybe this is a thing that we actually need, is sort of investing in some of this kind of conscious AI where they're leveraging these things. So, and I don't know if those two things connect exactly, but it does seem interesting to me to think about we've been working on this like intelligence curve. Well, what does the consciousness curve look like? And could you kind of have hello world versions of consciousness that is, I'm having emotions, I'm having, motivations. I'm not necessarily the smartest, but I am kind of like motivated in a way that looks more like human consciousness.
Yeah. And it's not clear to me if we're doing that right now or not.
Yeah.
Like if we're on the consciousness curve.
I think most of the conversation feels like, is our emotions going to be an accident that spills out of intelligence, which that's the argument, right? But I think there's also this is like, should you be creating it? Could you just try and create these emotions as their own, thing?
I think that's really interesting. It reminds me, like, people have been experimenting, you know, sending like cute little robots to old folks' homes.
Yeah.
And there's really good outcomes there.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, yeah, that's just a toy though. Like, why is that offering some real degree of companionship? And number one, it's interesting that that's occurring. But number two, if I put myself in those shoes and then I think, oh, that little robot dog is conscious, now I'm really invested.
Yeah.
Right. Now I have a real companion. Right. And so I think that would really, to a large part, potentially solve a lot of like these sort of loneliness.
Why?
issues.
I guess I'm wondering there, is that like rational that we ascribe so much value to consciousness? Like if it's the perfect zombie robot dog and it behaves exactly the same way, like why do I share the intuition with you that I wouldn't care about it.
So what's interesting is like, a lot of our friends, like when ChatGPT was released, some people I talked to had like real conversations. I didn't sort of interact with it this way.
And I know a lot of people who give positive reinforcement. They'll be like, "That's a really great answer. Thank you so much."
Yeah.
Or they'll
Yeah.
"Hey, I know this is this is like a difficult question, but I really want to know." You know, they sort of like have this veneer of politeness.
Well, I'm polite to it only because I think it biases its distributional output to be better.
Just like
Jeff,
giving
thoughts?
me like Westworld vibes of like the way that we treat the robots actually like grows or damages our own souls. So we should be nice.
What's the thought experiment? The most dangerous, that Rocco's basilisk or something? No.
Oh, yeah.
That's like AI is gonna. Do you know about this?
Yeah, I don't find it very compelling.
I don't find it compelling at all. I think it's so funny.
What I find most compelling is that people find it compelling.
I
That's
know.
interesting. to me.
Yeah.
It's kind of like also like I think Chalmers talks about the meta problem, which is why do people find the hard problems so fun to talk about? Or whatever.
I didn't know.
It's a great question. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up on time. Any, I don't know, closing thoughts? Anything else you guys want to cover or want to talk about? I thought we covered a lot of interesting ground.
Yeah, I thought this was super fun. I'm actually also more interested in sort of the meditative aspects. I mean, like it also makes,
I feel like you've like got a push-pull relation. You're like interested, but like
I'm super interested. But I also like it makes me wonder, like in the future, will like AIs be meditating?
Yeah, enlightened AI. Maybe that's the goal.
I bet we could get $100 million in funding for that right now.
Just like teach the AI to forget about its next word error over and over until it's awakened.
Yeah, but then it's gonna do a bad job at predicting, you know.
Yeah, but it'll be really nice. Like kind.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us. This was for ConCon, Consciousness Conversations. You can find us on the web at concon.show and wherever you like to watch podcasts. Also, if you're listening to this somewhere and you want us to leave us comments, go on, find us on YouTube. That's kind of the best place to interact with us.
Yep.
Sweet. This was fun.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.